This week we're doing exercise 8, which is the cardiovascular system. You'll use this PowerPoint as you read through exercise 8, which does start on page 73. Be sure to turn up your volume as needed because there is sound. While exercise 8 does start on page 73, it starts with some instructional objectives, and I wasn't going to go through those point by point. We'll cover most of them as we go through the lab exercise, but honestly, I keep better track of my things to know for 1409 lab exam file and teach more from that than the instructional objectives. But you're welcome to read through those as well. There is an introduction on page, starting on page 74 and continuing on page 75. Be sure to know any of the terms in bold or green. Especially on page 75, they'll talk about arteries that do go away from the heart. Any of the blood vessels that go away from the heart will have an artery type name. Most of them will be in red, but not all of them. Most of them will be in red because they're carrying oxygenated blood. Unfortunately, we'll see some of the exceptions to the red-blue theory first. The pulmonary artery does go away from the heart, but it does not carry oxygen, so it's actually in blue. Same sort of thing with veins. Veins will go towards the heart. All of the veins will go towards the heart and have some sort of vein type of name on them. They'll all go towards the heart. Most of them will be in blue because they're carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart to go out to the lungs. One of the exceptions to the red-blue theory is the pulmonary veins. They are going to the heart, so they do get a vein type of name, but they're carrying oxygenated blood because they have just been to the lungs. Yeah, we'll talk about that again too. Page 75 does have some materials listed. Don't worry about those. Those are more for our prep people for the on-campus lab so that they know what to bring out. And honestly, some of those haven't been updated in a while anyway. After that, letter D is methods. The methods will talk about some of the parts of the heart. You should probably read through those and concentrate on the terms in green or bold. That's fine. You'll need to be able to identify and give the function of all of the structures on figure 8.3. That is a interior structure of the heart pictures. The next few PowerPoint slides will talk about the structures and their functions in a little more detail. There's also an optional YouTube video. You're welcome to watch it. It goes through some of the parts and pieces and uses some slightly different vocabulary, but they're pointing out the same structures. Since figure 8.3 is actually labeled with the appropriate structure names, I'm going to go ahead and go through the passageway of blood through the heart, and I'll talk about the first place you see the blood coming through and then the second place and that sort of thing. In future lab exercises, when the parts are not labeled, I'll start at the top on the first blank line and just cover the parts in order so we keep track of which name goes in which blank. But since you've got the blanks already filled in, as it were, then I'm just going to go in order of the way the blood actually flows. So we'll be starting with the superior vena cava. It does carry deoxygenated blood from the upper body to the heart. Superior generally refers to above, and it's going to be bringing blood in from above the heart. The vena cava doesn't exactly say vein in the title, but like most veins, it is carrying blood to the heart, towards the heart. The next blood vessel is the inferior vena cava. It brings deoxygenated blood from the lower body to the heart. Inferior is usually below, and this blood vessel is handling any blood coming in from below the heart. So the abdomen and the legs, and honestly about 2/3 of the body. The inferior vena cava is the larger of the two vena cavas, but it does carry deoxygenated blood from the lower body. On our heart model here, you really can't see it from the front, and on the figure, it's coming in certainly from the bottom of the heart, and you just can't quite see that on our model, but you can see a little bit of the opening where it would be. Here's a better view of that inferior vena cava from the back side of the heart. Yeah, I turned the heart model upside down there. But it's still the inferior vena cava. It's still bringing the deoxygenated blood from the lower body to the heart. It's just easier to see in this view. We won't see a lot of the back side of the heart, although there are a few blood vessels back there that are easier to see. For the most part, I'll have the picture showing the front side. Blood coming from the superior and inferior vena cava do come together in the right atrium. It's the upper chamber on the right side. Blood comes from the superior and inferior vena cava to the right atrium. Do note that the right atrium is on the right side of the patient, not the right side of the picture. If you have to do stupid pet tricks and turn yourself around and make sure that that really is the correct right side of the heart, do what you have to. But honestly, a lot of times even the science majors, instructors, doctors get a little confused sometimes. And if you have to go into surgery nowadays for, say, your right kidney, they'll often have you take a Sharpie marker and put a check on the right side above your right kidney and an X above your left kidney so that nobody accidentally removes the wrong body part there. It's a little scary out there, but when we start talking about right and left on body parts, it really does refer to the right side of the patient, not the right side of the page. The right atrium is on the right side of the patient. Turn yourself around if you have to. But yes, it is on the left side of the picture, I know. From the right atrium, we will be going towards the right ventricle, but we got to go through a valve. The tricuspid valve separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. Its job is really to keep blood flowing in the proper direction. When the ventricle later squeezes and contracts, we don't want blood going back into the right atrium, so you got to have kind of like a door to separate the right atrium from the right ventricle. That would be the tricuspid valve. It actually, in real life, does have three parts. Tri would be code for three, like tricycle has three wheels. The tricuspid valve actually has three flaps. Although you can only really see two of them in the picture, there really are three flaps. And tri would be three, cusps would be the flaps. Three flaps. The tricuspid valve and the matching bicuspid valve later do have to be tied down, as it were. They're tied down by chordae tendineae, which would be some heartstrings. Their job is to keep the cuspid valves from flapping into the atria so that blood does flow in the correct direction. The chordae tendineae are shown on figure 8.3 on the right side of the heart, left side of the page, but really they do exist on both sides and do tie down both cuspid valves, both the tricuspid that we've seen already and the bicuspid that we'll see soon. Those chordae tendineae have to be attached to something in the ventricle. They're attached to papillary muscles. Papillary muscles attach the chordae tendineae to the ventricle wall. Again, they are found on both the right and the left sides of the heart for both the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. Blood went from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve. It does get into the right ventricle. The right ventricle is the lower chamber on the right-hand side of the patient. It does receive oxygenated blood from the right atrium, which, yes, it technically had to go through the tricuspid valve as well. When the right ventricle contracts, blood is going to go towards the lungs. Generally, when you talk about lungs, you talk about something that's a pulmonary structure. So we'll be going towards a pulmonary artery going away from the heart, but we got to go through another valve. The valve is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. It connects the right ventricle with the pulmonary arteries. Unfortunately, it's got some problems. First of all, it's not on my model, so it's kind of hard to put it on a lab practical, although I could put it by definition. The other problem is the lab book has a typo. Figure 8.3 has something labeled a pulmonary trunk semilunar valve. I don't know what happened. Something went wrong somewhere. There's no such thing as a pulmonary trunk semilunar valve. There is a pulmonary trunk, which we'll save for anatomy class, and there's a pulmonary semilunar valve that we need to know. What you'll want to do is cross off one out of the 4 words. Cross off trunk, so it reads pulmonary semilunar valve. Although it's still not shown on this model, I suppose I could actually make a photocopy of figure 8.3 and point to the pulmonary semilunar valve and ask you to identify that structure. But technically it's on my heart model, it's just on the piece that's been removed. So it's kind of hard to see. You'll just have to imagine something. Yeah, great. Sorry about that. From the imaginary pulmonary semilunar valve, no, it's really there, it's just not on my picture. But from the pulmonary semilunar valve, blood is going to go away from the heart, so we'll be headed towards a pulmonary artery, and it is going to go away from the heart into a lung, so we'll have some pulmonary stuff there. Technically in anatomy class, if you've only got one blood vessel for a few inches there, that would actually be the pulmonary trunk. There really is such a thing as a pulmonary trunk. There is one blood vessel going away from the heart towards the 2 lungs. The pulmonary trunk is the single artery before it splits. After the pulmonary artery has split into after the pulmonary trunk has split into 2 blood vessels, anatomy class starts talking about the pulmonary arteries. We'll want to learn the pulmonary arteries and not worry about the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary arteries are the 2 blood vessels, some going to the right, some going to the left, that are carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart. They do get an artery type name because they are going away from the heart. They're pulmonary because they're going to the lungs, but they are arteries. They're going away from the heart. They are in blue because they're carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart. Honestly, they're going to the lungs to pick up the oxygen. The lungs aren't really shown in this picture, and honestly, even in the on-campus lab, I don't bother to bring out the lung models because we're doing lungs next week. You'll just have to imagine the lungs for a few days. The lungs would take in oxygen, and then you'd breathe out the carbon dioxide. We'd exchange the oxygen and the carbon dioxide in the respiratory system. Everything from here on out, however, will have some red blood vessels because we're carrying oxygenated blood around. Once the blood has been to the lungs and picked up its oxygen, it does need to come back to the heart. Any of the blood vessels that are going towards the heart are going to get a vein type of name. So we'll be talking about the pulmonary veins that take oxygenated blood to the left atrium. Technically, there are 2 pulmonary veins coming from the right lung and 2 pulmonary veins coming from the left lung. Remember, I've switched the model around so we're looking at the back side, so the pulmonary veins to the from the left lung are actually on the left side of the picture as well as being on the left side of the model. On figure 8.3, we're still looking at things from the front, so the left side of the patient is on one side and the left side of the page is on the other. It gets a little confusing there, but the pulmonary veins coming from the left lung are coming from the left lung of the patient, and it may be a little interesting depending on which picture you're looking at. I really don't know why there's one pulmonary artery going away from the right ventricle and there are 2 pulmonary veins coming back. I really don't know what's up with that, although there is 1 aorta going away and 2 vena cavas coming back in, so it at least keeps to the same pattern. Okay, that was trivial knowledge for trivial minds. The pulmonary veins do take oxygenated blood from the lungs and go to the left atrium. The left atrium is the upper chamber on the left side of the heart that receives the oxygenated blood. Remember, it is on the left side of the patient, not the left side of the page. From the left atrium, we will be going to the left ventricle, but we've got to go through a valve. This valve on the left side is going to be the bicuspid or mitral valve, which connects the left atrium and the left ventricle. On figure 8.3, the lab book just has it labeled mitral valve. You'll probably want to add /bicuspid valve because I usually do refer to it as the bicuspid valve. Bi would be 2, cuspid would be flaps. It does actually have 2 flaps on it. Tricuspid has 3, bicuspid has 2 flaps. The other trick with a bicuspid valve, bi is 2, it's kind of on the second side of the heart. I know it's a stupid way to remember things, but I remember the bicuspid valve is on the second side of the heart, and that works for me. Other people remember that the bicuspid valve is the one that has the second name. The mitral valve, bicuspid or mitral valve, it's the same difference. The mitral valve is a slightly older term, but the bicuspid is the slightly newer term. On a lab practical or one of my lecture exams, if you're taking my lecture, any choices that include the bicuspid valve, it'll actually say bicuspid/mitral valve, so you're welcome to learn it either way. Honestly, the reason I think they leave mitral valve around is because one of the problems you can have is a mitral valve prolapse. When the mitral valve has prolapsed or has a little opening and it's letting blood back into the left atrium where it's not supposed to go. If you've just got a little bit of blood flowing back into the left atrium, it's just a little bit of a problem. If you've got a lot of blood flowing back into the left atrium, it's quite a bit of a problem, and you might have to have surgery to fix your mitral valve prolapse. So if we called the bicuspid valve a bicuspid valve all the time, nobody'd realize what a mitral valve prolapse was. Yeah, well, if we call it a mitral valve all the time, it's kind of confusing because it's on the second side of the heart, and bicuspid, 2 valves, second side, 2 flaps, works a lot better for most people. Oh well, remember it whichever way you need to. Blood goes from the left atrium through that bicuspid valve to the left ventricle. Oh yeah, keep in mind that bicuspid valve also had chordinae tendineae and papillary muscles attached to it. We talked about that back with the tricuspid valve, but I forgot to point it out again. The left ventricle is the lower chamber on the left side of the heart. One of the things to notice, although it's a little hard to see here, is that the wall of the left ventricle is a lot thicker than the wall of the right ventricle. This is because the left ventricle has to force blood further than the right ventricle does. The right ventricle was just pushing blood out maybe an inch or 2 to the lungs. The left ventricle is going to force blood out to all of the rest of the body, up to the head against gravity, down to the feet and the toes. Okay, I admit gravity will help a lot, but if you're upside down on the monkey bars, your heart still has to be able to push the blood upside down all the way to the toes. And that left ventricle does have to give a big shove, so it does have to have a relatively larger muscle. Blood does go from the left ventricle out to the aorta and out to all the rest of the body. But we've got one last valve. The aortic semilunar valve connects the left ventricle and the aorta. It's a little hard to see on the model because you really ought to be looking more underneath, but there is an aortic semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. It functions a lot like the pulmonary semilunar valve that was on the right side of the heart going to the pulmonary arteries. When the ventricle contracts, blood does go through the aortic semilunar valve. While the heart is contracting, while the heart is relaxing, you don't want blood flowing from the aorta back into the ventricle, so you do close a valve behind it. Blood went from the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta. The aorta takes oxygenated blood away from the heart and to all the rest of the body. It'll take the first section off the top goes to the right head and arm. the next piece is going to go to the left side of the head, and the next piece is going to go to the left arm. Yeah, whatever. The aorta does carry blood from the heart to all of the rest of the body. If you start looking online in some of the other books, you might see some different names for the different section of the aorta. Where it goes up, anatomy class does call it an ascending aorta. Where it kind of goes across, they'll call it an aortic arch, and then it's going to descending aorta. It's going to descend behind the heart. Part of it goes through the thoracic cavity, so you'd have a thoracic aorta. Part of it goes through the abdominal pelvic cavity, so you have an abdominal aorta. We're non-science majors. We're going to call the whole thing an aorta and go on with life. But be advised, out there in the real world, there might be a minor adjective in front of it that describes part of the aorta. The last structure that was on figure 8.3 is the interventricular septum. Inter is going to be between, ventricular would be ventricles. This is going to be a wall of heart muscle between the right and the left ventricles. Well, you did have to have something to separate the right side from the left side of the heart, and between the ventricles you do call it an interventricular septum. Hey, wait a minute. If there's something between the ventricles, what's between the atriums? Honestly, there's an interatrial septum as well, but we'll save that for anatomy class. It didn't make it onto our figure 8.3, so we don't need to know it. It's fine, but yes, it does actually exist. In the lab book, the descriptions of the structures from figure 8.3 do continue to page 78. Feel free to read all about those or just go with the short definitions that were in this PowerPoint. On page 78, there's a little ways down, there's letter B, the arteries and veins. We're actually supposed to observe comparable arteries and veins under the low power of a microscope, but yeah, well, you probably don't have a microscope at home, so here's some pictures I found on the internet. Remember that arteries do go away from the heart. They tend to have thicker walls and, in general, are more circular. On the left-hand side of the picture, you can see the thicker wall a little easier on the artery, and it does have a relatively thick wall with a lot of elastic. That way, when the heart contracts and forces the blood into the artery, it will expand out and then it contracts back down so that it snaps back, heartbeat after heartbeat. The veins, on the other hand, go towards the heart. They tend to have thinner walls and might even collapse. The veins don't have as thick of a wall. They've generally got a much thinner wall. It doesn't have near as much elasticity and elastic fibers. That's because there's not as much pressure in the veins, so it doesn't have to be as reinforced. On the more red picture on the left-hand side, you can see the little bit of thin vein walls. On the picture on the right-hand side, that's actually what most of our slides look like in the lab. A pink blob where it's hard to see anything. Ultimately, the artery there does have a relatively thick wall, even thicker than the picture on the left. And I did put a little red arrow so you can see where it does go from one side to the other. I tried to put a little blue arrow on the vein, but it's such a thin wall that you can't see the arrow and you can't figure out what happened there. But from the tip of the main arrow to the inside, you can see that's a lot thinner of a wall. The veins, because they do have such thin walls, when you slice into them, they might collapse. That's why the vein on the far right-hand side is not really perfectly circular. It's kind of collapsed. Partially the artery may be pushing into it, but partially when you slice it with the knife, it's probably going to collapse into more of an oval or possibly even a straight line depending on who's doing what cuttings there. There is a spot on page 85 to draw the artery and the vein in cross-section. You should draw that there. Then maybe you'll want to move on to the next slide. Yes, we'll do some flipping back and forth between the lab book from here on out. Page 78 in the lab book continues on and has a small paragraph about the heart being a double pump. You should read all about that. Honestly, when we talk about blood coming into the superior and inferior vena cava, going into the right atrium and the right ventricle and out to the lungs and the left atrium, the left ventricle, it makes it sound like blood is only in the right side of the heart or only in the left side of the heart. That's not true. Blood is coming into both the right atrium and the left atrium at the same time. When the atriums contract, blood will go through both the cuspid valves at the same time into the right and the left ventricles at the same time. The ventricles will then contract and force blood into the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve, and then the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. But blood is in both sides of the heart at the same time. Yes, the right side blood is going to go to the lungs, and on the left side the blood is going to go to the rest of the body. But the heart itself is a double pump. Both sides are having blood pumped through at the same time. On page 78, and continuing on the next few pages, you'll need to be able to identify selected arteries and veins. There's an unnumbered table that does have the blood vessels and their functions, and then figure 8.5a and 8.5b and c and d does have pictures of our artery man. Those pictures in the lab book are actually better than the pictures of my model, so the picture I've got's not going to look real good. You're probably going to want to look at your pictures, and I'm going to have to scan in a copy of your pictures for the lab practical when I ask you to identify selected arteries and veins. On page 78 and 79, there is, again, an unnumbered table with the blood vessels and their functions. Some of the blood vessels are really hard to see on our models. Some of them aren't labeled. Some of them are just bit. Okay, we had an anatomy instructor who wrote exercise 8, and they got into a little more detail. Some of these arteries and veins we're going to save for torturing anatomy students. Others of them are better seen on other models rather than figure 8.5a and b and c and d. So when you're looking at the chart, put a check by the ones that we do need to know, and maybe put an X or cross out the ones you don't need to know. Of the blood vessels we do need to know, the aorta is certainly a good one to know. It is seen on the heart model, so it won't be on artery man like it is on figure 8. I forget which one it is. 8.5, I don't know what letter it is. But it won't be on artery man on a lab practical. I'd have a picture of the heart. Same thing with the superior and inferior vena cava. They're on the heart model. They're a lot easier to spot and tag on the heart model than they are on artery man. I know, he's got them, but it's not worth looking at on there. Some that we do need to know include the carotid arteries and the jugular veins. The carotid arteries are going to be the red blood vessels in the neck. They are going away from the heart and take blood to the head. The jugular veins are going to be the blue ones in the neck. They would take blood from the head, take deoxygenated blood from the head to the heart. The subclavian arteries and veins, sub is below, clave is the start of the clavicle, the collarbone. The subclavian arteries and veins run below the clavicle or the collarbone, kind of from the middle of the neck to the point of the shoulder. I still haven't figured out anatomy-wise what exactly you call that region, but kind of from the neck to the shoulder would be the subclavian arteries. Again, the red one would be the artery carrying oxygenated blood, and the blue one would be the vein carrying the deoxygenated blood. The hepatic artery and vein, hepatic refers to the liver, and the hepatic artery takes blood to the liver to be filtered. The hepatic vein takes blood away from the liver, going back to the heart to pick up more oxygen. The renal artery and vein can be seen on the artery man pictures, but It's going to be better later in exercise 11, which is the urinary system. We'll have a kidney and we'll have it blown up really big, and it'll be really easy to see the red renal artery going away from the heart into the kidney, and the blue renal vein that's going back from the kidney back to the heart. The iliac arteries and veins, they're a little complicated. You do have the red aorta coming off the heart and going through the thoracic cavity. It goes through the abdominal pelvic cavity. It then splits in two. When the blood vessel splits into two and goes into the leg, it's called the femoral artery and the femoral vein. Unfortunately, they're cut off on the Artery Man model, so we crossed them off already. But the iliac artery is after the aorta splits, but before it reaches the leg. So pretty much after the aorta splits, it's going through the pelvic region down there. That would be the red iliac artery and the matching blue iliac vein coming from the leg before it joins up together with the other iliac vein to make up the inferior vena cava. A little complicated, but the red and the blue things in the pelvic area. The last vein is the great saphenous vein. It's the only blue thing in the leg that we're going to need to know. So look for that one. It is a spare vein, a superfluous vein. There's really not a great saphenous artery. There's no matching artery. That's a little weird. It is a little weird. But honestly, we use that spare vein if we're going to do a heart bypass surgery. Because there's no matching artery, we can take the spare vein, and it does affect circulation problems later, but it's not as bad of a deal because there's not a matching artery. And in spite of the fact that it's a little hard to see on the model sometimes, I do leave it on there because it is almost vital to the bypass surgery stuff. You take parts of the great saphenous vein to do bypass surgeries. I suppose now's as good of a time as any to talk about the coronary arteries. They're really not on too many of our pictures, although I believe they're actually on figure 8.2 if you wanted to see where they are in real life. What they do is they supply the heart itself with oxygen. You'd think the heart, carrying all this blood around, could just suck the oxygen out of the inside of the heart, but honestly, especially the thick wall of the left ventricle, it's too thick to be properly oxygenated, and heck, the right side of the heart is carrying a bunch of deoxygenated blood around to start with. That's probably a bad idea. The coronary arteries are going away from the heart, but they're going towards the heart. Yeah, they're a problem on the definition. They are going away from the left ventricle, but they do supply the heart itself with oxygen. So it is a very important artery, and if you've got a blocked coronary artery, that could lead to a heart attack if it's blocked with fat or cholesterol or an embolism or horrible, awful, nasty things. If the coronary artery is blocked, that can lead to a heart attack. And what they can do later is a bypass surgery on the next slide. If you do have a blocked coronary artery, a bypass surgery can take a piece of the great saphenous vein, hook it into the aorta, and hook the other end just past the blocked heart artery and bypass the blockage. That would be a single bypass surgery. If you're bypassing a second coronary artery, that would be a double bypass. A triple bypass bypasses 3, quadruple bypass does 4. They don't really have names for bypassing 5 and 6 blood vessels, but you can actually do quite a few of them there. The Heart Point Gallery does have a short, maybe 15-second animation of a bypass surgery and where you'd hook things in. You're welcome to look at that. If you are interested, the second video is a real bypass surgery video, complete with warnings on graphic views and things like that. If you're not that interested, just click on to the next slide and know that it's out there somewhere even if you didn't want to see it. That's fine. But if you are interested, it's pretty cool to watch. On page 80, the lab book seems to think we should work in pairs. That might be difficult. On the other hand, really, in my on-campus lab, we still don't work in pairs for this. But on page 80, you should be able to take your pulse. There is also a spot on page 85 to record your pulse rate at rest. So what you do is you take the tip of the index and middle finger and put it on a pulse site and press lightly. Don't use your thumb. The reason they tell you not to use your thumb is because your thumb does have a relatively good-sized blood vessel in it, and you might count one pulse from, say, your wrist, and one pulse from, say, your thumb, and 3 from your wrist, 4 from your thumb, and double count there. That would be bad. So ideally, just use your index and middle finger there. You do need to take your pulse for a minute, which might require a watch or a clock with a second hand, or a cell phone with seconds on it, or maybe you just look at the cell phone, digital clock, what have you, wait for the number to turn to the next whole number, start taking your pulse, and wait for it to come back around. Fine, whatever. Normal pulse rates are in the 60 to 80 range. If your pulse is running a lot lower than 60, nobody really worries about you. You probably exercise a lot and your heart rate is probably just very efficient. If you're running a lot higher than 80 beats per minute, you might worry about that a little bit, especially if you've truly been at rest and your heartbeat is, say, 120 beats per minute. That's a little high. You might get that checked out. Now, personally, I happen to be, fat, overweight, out of shape. So when my pulse rate is in the 90 to 100 range, I'm not real worried about it because I do know what the problem is. I need to exercise some more. At any rate, do record your pulse rate on page 85. The lab book next wants you to vigorously exercise. Run in place, run around your house, run up around the block, do whatever you need to, but exercise for about 2 minutes. Then check your heart rate and record it on page 85. They're also going to want you to record your heart rate 2 minutes after you stop exercising, and again 5 minutes after you stop exercising. It may take a few minutes to get back to the PowerPoint, but do be sure to check your pulse rate and record it on page 85. What most people find with their pulse rate, the average is generally 60 to 80 beats per minute, although the true average is closer to 70 there. That's for at rest. Immediately after exercise, most people will add 5, maybe 10 beats per minute to that. If you're on the 60 side of things and do exercise quite a bit, you may only raise your pulse rate by 5 beats per minute. Feel free, that's fine. On the other hand, if you're on the 70 side of things, 2 minutes worth of exercise is probably going to raise your heartbeat about, say, 10 beats per minute. So ideally get the correct number from running around the house, but yeah, a nice round number to plug in is going to be 80. 2 minutes after exercise, most people are about halfway down to their resting heartbeat, so add 2 to 5 beats to your at-rest heartbeat, and you'd be somewhere probably around 75 or so. After about 5 minutes, you should be back down to normal or at rest, so you should be back down to, say, 70 beats per minute. One of the things they're doing on a stress test is, they put you on the treadmill and they crank up the incline so that it gets harder and harder and harder. Partially what they're doing is they're checking your heart rate to see how high your heart rate can actually go. And then they're also checking to see how fast your heart rate comes back down. I admit my heart rate goes up pretty quick, pretty easily, but it also comes back down pretty quickly as well. If your heart rate only goes up to 75, but it takes 20 minutes to come back down to 70, something's probably going wrong there too, and they're going to worry about you on that one. If you are at all concerned with your pulse rate, do check with your doctor rather than your instructor. I teach biology, but I don't actually have a medical degree. On page 81, the lab book wants us to use a stethoscope to listen to the sounds of the heart. I haven't exactly got a stethoscope at my house either, so I'm not sure where you're supposed to get one. However, there are some simulations online. www.easyacoustillation, yeah, that's the fancy-smancy term for you listening to heart sounds, has some heart sounds that you can listen to. You'll want to click Begin Course in the middle, and there's a little arrow on the chest. You'll want to click that little arrow on the chest. Be sure to turn up your volume if you haven't got it up already, because the heart sounds are probably a little fainter than the instructor sounds. You can listen to any of them that you'd like, but at least listen to the first and second heart sounds, normal and unsplit, although they go into some other more disease type of problems. But try to listen and see if you can identify the two sounds that the lab book talks about, the lub and the dup. The lab book does talk about the two heart sounds on page 81. The heart generally does make a lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub type of noise. The lub is the first heart sound, and it comes from the cuspid valves closing. Blood goes into the right atrium and the left atrium. The atriums contract. Blood goes into the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The ventricles start to contract, and the cuspid valves have to close to keep blood out of the atrius. When the cuspid valves close, you can actually hear a little noise. That's the lub part. The dup is the second sound, and it comes from the semilunar valves closing. The right and the left ventricle will contract. Blood will go through the pulmonary semilunar valve and the aortic semilunar valve into the pulmonary arteries and the aorta. When the heart starts relaxing and filling with blood, you don't want gravity to take over and have blood going from the pulmonary artery and the aorta going back into the ventricles. You want blood coming from the atria to the ventricle and not the wrong direction, so the semilunar valves have to close. That creates a little bit of turbulence, and you can actually hear a dup sound. If necessary, go back to the Easy Acoustillation site and see if you can identify the lub and the dup sound. How am I going to ask that on a lab practical? Honestly, what was I supposed to do? Ask you if you can hear the heart sounds? Everybody's going to say they can. So I would have to ask it more by definition. What's the first sound? A, lub, B, dup. The first sound would be a lub. Which one comes from the semilunar valves closing? Lub or dup? Semilunar would be the dup valves closing. So I can ask it by definition, but be sure to hear what you're supposed to hear. Also on page 81, the lab book wants you to check your blood pressure. If you haven't got a stethoscope at home, what are the odds you have a sphygmomanometer actually take blood pressure? Well, I don't have one either. But basically, the way it works is you inflate a blood pressure cuff up to a rather high pressure, higher than the pressure from the heart. When you're listening with the stethoscope, there'd be no noise in the stethoscope. You slowly release the pressure until the pressure in the cuff is less than the pressure of the heartbeat. There's now a little bit of noise as a little bit of blood comes through the brachial artery. Note the pressure on the blood pressure cuff. That's the systolic pressure, or the heart contracting. You keep releasing the pressure until the pressure in the blood pressure cuff is less than the pressure in the arteries. Yeah, there's too much pressurized in this thing. But at that point, there's no noise in the stethoscope because all of the blood is getting through the brachial artery. Do note the pressure. That's the diastolic pressure, or the heart relaxing. Hang on, we'll be talking about this for quite some time. For the more visual people, part number 1 has an arm, and all of the blood is getting through the brachial artery. part number 2, they've attached the blood pressure cuff. They forgot their stethoscope, which would be easier to insert before you start inflating the blood pressure cuff. But if you've got blood pressure of, say, 120/80, you do inflate the pressure in the cuff above the 120 number, say to 130. At that point, it does cut off all the circulation to the arm. Yeah, that's why some of the blood pressure machines hurt just a little, is because you cut off circulation to the arm. When you are listening to the stethoscope, there's no noise. Well, yeah, there's no blood coming through. In part number 3, they have released the pressure in the cuff slowly so that the pressure in the cuff is about the same pressure as the heart. Really, if your heart's beating at 120 pounds of mercury per square pounds of pressure, at 120, if you've got, say, 119 pressurized in the blood pressure cuff, you should be getting, it's probably more than a drop of blood, but you'd get a little bit of blood coming through every time the heart beats. You'd be able to hear that, just barely, in the stethoscope. Note the pressure. That's the systolic pressure, is the first time you hear a noise. You keep releasing the pressure, and in number 4, when the pressure in the blood pressure cuff is less than the pressure in the arteries, the 80 thing, when you get down to 79 in the blood pressure cuff, all of the blood is going through the artery there, and there's no turbulence. You don't hear anything in the stethoscope. Note the pressure. That's the diastolic pressure, the last time you hear a noise. Okay, here's our definitions again. Systole would be when the heart contracts. It is the higher number. If you're talking about 120/80, it'd be the 120 part. And again, it's the first sound you hear in the stethoscope. You increase the pressure higher than the blood pressure. When you come back down, the first thing you hear is when the heart contracts. That would be the systole or systolic number. Diastole is the heart relaxing. There's still pressure in the system due to pressure in the arteries and all the elasticity in the thick wall of the arteries. The diastolic number is the lower number, the 80 of the 120/80, and it was the last time you heard a sound in the stethoscope. By the time you get the pressure in the blood pressure cuff down to the pressure in the arteries, or less than the pressure in the arteries, all the blood is getting through the artery. You don't hear any more sounds. Note the pressure. That was the last thing you heard, was the diastolic number. The diastolic number is almost a measure of the elasticity in the arteries. So the systolic number has more to do with the heart, and the diastole has more to do with the elastic in the arteries. The easy acoustillation site does have some blood pressure simulations, but it's a little difficult to get to. You gotta go to the top of the page, select blood pressure, and then from the drop-down menu, taking blood pressure. They'll have a lot of information, some of the how you use the stethoscope, how you use their simulator. Read through any of the information you need to, but scroll down to Cases Related to Blood Pressure Part 1. Again, you can play with any of the case studies that you'd like on the table of contents, but on the kind of middle to right side, look for the 40-year-old man with the headaches and shortness of breath. Click that one, obviously. Next, you'll want to click Cuff underneath the 40-year-old man with headaches, beside the history, before the acoustillation and the diagnosis, and then we'll finally be where we need to be. Once you finally get to the part of the website that has the pressure gauge, you'll want to inflate the cuff. It may take several clickings to get the cuff up high enough, because honestly, this poor guy does have some high blood pressure. You'll need to inflate the cuff to the point where you no longer hear any sounds. Hint, about 180. You'll open the valve a third of the way and wait for it. You'll note the pressure the first time you hear a sound. It'll take a little while as it keeps going down, but note the pressure at the last time you hear a sound. Then be sure to open the valve fully so you release your victim, well, at least in real life. If you scroll down a little further, there's a spot to check your answer. You are welcome to play with any of the lots of blood pressure scenarios and read through some other stuff, but at least do the 40-year-old man with the headaches and shortness of breath. The lab book would really like you to try and get your own blood pressure. It is optional, but highly suggested to go to your local grocery store, Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, that sort of thing, and check your blood pressure in one of their fancy machines. You just put your arm in, push the start button, wait for a few minutes, and it should give you a nice number: systolic pressure, diastolic pressure, and even a pulse rate. If you can, go get your blood pressure checked just in case. If you can't, you're going to go with 120/80. So what do the numbers mean? 120/80 is considered to be normal blood pressure. 140/90, notice the top number's gone up and the diastolic number's gone up as well. That would be a high blood pressure or hypertension. If you do have low blood pressure, say less than 100/70, nobody really worries about you. You'll probably have colder feet in the wintertime, cold feet, cold fingers, probably because the blood doesn't have as much pressure behind the heart and it's not circulating quite as well, but nobody generally worries too much about you if you have low blood pressure. Now, high blood pressure, that can be a problem. The heart wears out faster. You worry about the arteries exploding and having an aneurysm or something like that. So yeah, they worry a lot more if you have hypertension and high blood pressure. The 140 says your heart is working harder. The 90 says there's a lot of pressure on the arteries as well, and you don't want those to be too overly pressurized. 120/50, the 120 part says the heart's doing just fine. The 50 says there's not a lot of elastic in the arteries. They call that hardening of the arteries, or atherosclerosis. They do worry about that because your arteries are getting harder and brittle and more fragile. If you do put too much pressure on them, they might snap as well. You'd still talk about it being an aneurysm, but it'd be because the arteries don't have enough elasticity rather than exploding from the excess pressure. Whatever you do, don't let the numbers meet. 85/80 would be a really, really, really bad heart. The 85 says your heart's not pumping very hard. The 80 says your arteries have elastic just fine. They're doing okay. If you do get 80/80, since the first 80 is supposed to be the heart contracting and it's not contracting any better than the normal pressure in the blood vessels, that's kind of dead because the heart's not beating. Whatever you do, don't let the numbers meet. The lab book on page 81 does want you to check your blood pressure. You might have to run to a store and check one of the fancy smancy machines. They'd like you to record it on page 85. If you don't have a fancy smancy machine handy and you don't have any other numbers, go with 120/80. The lab book wants you to run around Walmart for 2 minutes. Yeah, that's a little scary, sorry. Generally what happens after exercise, if you're just doing 2 minutes worth of exercise, really your blood pressure should not change. You should still have whatever blood pressure you had before, say 120/80. Which means after 2 minutes, you've still got your normal blood pressure, 120/80, and after 5 minutes, you've still got your same numbers. Funny, it's back to normal since it never left normal. One of the things they're testing on the stress test, they're checking to see how high your pulse rate will go and how fast it comes back down, but they're also checking your blood pressure at the high exercise conditions. My blood pressure at high exercise conditions, I do have a little bit of blood pressure problems when I do severely exercise, which tells me I'm probably going to have some blood pressure problems in the future when I do get older. On the other hand, since my dad's on blood pressure medicine too, that doesn't really surprise me and shouldn't surprise anybody who's taken any kind of genetics. Oh well. But keep an eye on your blood pressure, because if it does start going up, there are some medicines that you can, that your doctor can prescribe that will help bring that pressure back down so that maybe you live a little longer with your heart. On page 85 and 86, there are some questions to be answered. I was going to let you answer those, although there are some that you can omit. On page 85, letter A, trace the pathway of blood through the heart. Indicate which structures carry oxygen and oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Just omit that. Now, only omit part A, but do omit that. You're welcome to know that, but I am not actually going to ask you questions about tracing the pathway of blood. I will not tell you that blood is in the tricuspid valve. What chamber of the heart is it going to next? Tricuspid goes into the right ventricle. If it helps you to picture the blood flowing through, if it helps to know the pathway of blood, by all means do know the pathway of blood. Or if your lecture instructor asks you about it, that's fine, but I wasn't going to ask it on the lab practical. And yeah, if I'm your lecture instructor, I'm not asking about tracing the pathway of blood in lecture either. But you probably should keep an eye on which structures carry oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. But for the lab, omit part A. You can still answer I and II, and B, C, D, blah. Effective exercise, we did actually answer. Letter F talks about target pulse rate. Go ahead and omit that one. We didn't see any of that in the lab chapter, so I still haven't figured out why it's a question in the back, and it's not on the lab exam, it's not on the lecture exercise. If you'd like, email me and I'd be happy to talk to you about why knowing your target heart rate would be a great thing, but the rest of us are just going to skip over it. Be careful on letter G. One of the arteries does not have the same name in the vein. Also, letter J, we did not see the pericardium, so just omit that one. However, to make sure that you're actually answering the questions and that you're answering them correctly, you will need to submit your answers in the Exercise 8 lab book questions that will be on Blackboard. On the left-hand side, there's a folder for lab book questions of all things, and it has the questions. Put your answer down, click your answer, and at the end, when you after you click submit, you can scroll down and click OK, and it will give you the correct answers. While it is kind of listed as a quiz, Blackboard does not record the grade anywhere. It is not really for a grade. I will never check it. I won't actually see it, so you can try it multiple times and kind of use it as a little backup quiz for yourself. But it does make sure that you're actually getting the correct answers there. That's actually all I have for Exercise 8. Be sure to look over the structures and the functions on all the figures, be able to answer questions about pulse rate and blood pressure and things like that. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me, call, or come by my office, and hopefully I can help. Thank you. See you next week. Oh, don't forget to take the online quiz. There is a 5-point quiz under Lab Quizzes, kind of like the one for Lab Safety. Be sure to take it before Tuesday at 11 p.m. Thank you.